Many of us would like to believe that we are living in democratic societies with leaders elected by the people, sort of man of the people or the people's choice, which subsequently would lead us to believe that our governments have our best interests at heart. You see, we both know, you and I, we rely on our governments to provide us with education, healthcare, public safety, transport, defense, and many of the things that make our societies function. So if we were, think about it, heading towards a global financial depression that would affect the well-being of you and I, but not only you and I, but also of billions of people, we would like to think that they'd tell us, right? So we could prepare for what's coming, take steps to get ready. But what if the government-elected people would do exactly the opposite? What if they were hiding the truth in order to manipulate us to do the exact opposite of what truly would benefit you and I? In a recent poll that I just launched, I asked the very basic question: do you trust your government? And believe it or not, more than 80% of everyone who participated answered they do not trust their government. And rightfully so. So in this video, I will be revealing the financial lies and the manipulations that are being sold/told to us in order to keep us in the dark about what is really happening to our economy. The manipulation is so strong or so severe that it could be misleading billions of people to believe the illusions that things are okay when really, honestly, nothing is okay. In fact, we might potentially be on the verge of a huge economic collapse. In fact, the biggest one we have seen in a century. But before we move on, I want to welcome you to Crypto Never Sleeps. And in case you're new to this channel and want to stay on top of what's really going on in the crypto world, but also in the financial traditional world, then please hit like, smash subscribe so that you can be notified every time we upload new videos. Now, first things first, and we always need to go a bit back in history. And let's go back to the 1970s. Because during the 70s, most of the Western world was hit by serious inflation. And this was a result of an energy crisis and the US dollar no longer being linked to the value of gold, and obviously also many other factors. However, the end result was massive inflation, and the cost of goods and services going up for just about everything and everybody. Alone in the United States, inflation hit its peak in 1974 when it rose above 11%. And at the end of the decade, it became even worse when it hit closer to 14%. Now, before we move on, I just want to point out one thing. It's very rare that I agree with mainstream media. But recently, on Fox News, Tucker Carlson, he has been really hitting the point. And when he was talking about inflation, I could only agree with him. You see, inflation is the cause, or it has been at least in the past, the real reason for a revolution from within. Now, I want you to remember the numbers that I just mentioned previously. Remember, we were hitting above 11% in 1974, but actually almost close to 14%. The reason being is that this inflation caused massive levels of unemployment, a spike in bankruptcies and housing to become significantly more unaffordable for the majority of society. And that is what leads us to the current situation. The current economic situation today is, and if I have to state it bluntly, I do not believe that many of the American startups are going to make it past the next recession. And the next big recession will hit us soon. In fact, we could actually be right in the midst of it. You see, people, they think that even though inflation is high, they say, or they are being informed by the people's choice of elected leaders, that it's nowhere near the 1970s level and that we shouldn't be too worried at all. Well, this is where one of the biggest lies in our, let's say, lifetime comes in. Let's call it the inflation lie. You see, the inflation lie is that just last year it was announced that inflation had hit around 6%, at least in the United States. However, with the majority of the West and also the European Union very much not far behind. So around 6%, that doesn't sound like a very big number, does it now? However, it is the highest level of inflation that we have seen in 31 years. But now listen to this. Inflation isn't actually around 6%. It is much higher than that. It is actually much higher than what it was in the 1970s. And this very fact has been hidden away from us by the people that are meant to look out for us. Remember, the choice of the people. People's man, Sleepy Uncle Joe. So the question is, how am I able to stand here on my little YouTube channel and claiming that inflation is not what we are being informed by mainstream media? Well, you see, inflation is calculated by something called the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. And the CPI basically takes the cost of things around you, everyday things, and estimates the cost of living each year based on how much more expensive things around you are becoming. So they are able to calculate inflation. So if the cost of living becomes 2%, let's say, cost of living becomes 2% more expensive, inflation is said to be at 2%. Now that sounds very simple, right? But what if the government were to manipulate the figures when it comes to inflation? You see, it seems that this possibility has been and is happening since many, many years. You see, previously the inflation was calculated by comparing the cost of a constant basket of supermarket goods over time. But that is not what we are or how we are calculating inflation at the moment. Today, the government, the US government and the European Union, they're actually able to manipulate that specific basket in order to determine what inflation stats should be presented. And let me give you an example. Now let's say the price of steak, we all like steak, right? Increases by 10% in just 1 year. Now instead of daily judging that steak has gotten more expensive and taking this into account with inflation and calculations, they're gonna do something entirely different that has never been done in history before. Actually, what they're going to do, they are going to substitute, can't say that word, steak for something much cheaper. And you know what that is? Hamburger meat. So what they can do is that they can take the hamburger meat, which they say is basically the same thing. But let's be honest, it's not, right? Steak is a steak, it's a sirloin, it's a tenderloin, right? And hamburger is something we mashed together. But what they are doing there is that they can do this with all sorts of items in order to keep inflation numbers low. Let's take another example than hamburger meat. Let's talk about real estate, because that's probably something that we all should understand, right? Because it is truly insane how far this manipulation can go. You see, real estate has, as you probably know, gone up drastically in the last couple of years. So you would imagine that the inflation rate around housing is based on real data and the actual increase of house and rent prices, right? That's how it should be. Well, that's not what they're doing. So instead of adding the increase of house prices, the government, and let me say that a third time, the government uses something called ONA equivalent rent. And this is just a fancy way of saying that they just ask a few homeowners, maybe even BlackRock, who anyway is the largest landowner in the United States. So they ask them what they think they could rent their property out for and use that number instead of the real facts. So their calculation is basically made up on opinions instead of real facts. So while we are seeing the housing market in America going up around 15 to 16% more over the last few years, the government are claiming that that's not true. They're saying, in fact, it only went up by 3.9%. So the question should be, well, didn't they always just use opinions? No, they didn't. And they didn't always use hamburger meat instead of steak. You see, things have changed over time. So what would actually happen if we ignore this manipulation and would actually go back to basics, go back to the facts or the way that they used to calculate CPI or inflation numbers? Now, before I move on, I would like to introduce the website of ShadowStats. I use it a lot, and I would recommend you to go in there and do your own research, because there you can see that John Williams on ShadowStats, they are actually using the CPI, or say they're calculating inflation based on the way the government used to calculate inflation. That is why I like it, because it gives me, and hopefully you too, a clear indication of what the level of current inflation is. So what would happen if the government would measure inflation the way like John Williams did? Because that is in fact the way the government used to do. You see, many prominent figures online, they have been heavily suggesting that governments, US and the European Union, they should be consistent in the way that they measure inflation. And if they were to do so, if they would measure it consistently, inflation right now would actually be closer to 15% as we see on ShadowStats. So what this means is that we could be potentially, and that's what I think, on the verge of one of the biggest financial collapses of our generation. A financial depression, or call it a collapse, so devastating that it could end up in food shortages, skyrocketing debt, and so many other ugly things that you and we cannot even begin to imagine. But you see, not everyone is agreeing with you and I that things are actually getting worse or they are that bad. You see, a lot of mainstream media, I'm not going to mention any names, they would like you to believe that things are going to be different. That there's no way that we are going to see anything as we saw back in the 1970s. Now, personally, I do not trust my government, and I also do not trust the mainstream media. Now, who you are going to trust is up to you. But what I do is I go out and I try to follow what it used to be. How did they used to calculate this basket? And then I do my own little calculation. And what I come up to is that I actually believe ShadowStats more than I believe my own government. So the question is and remains, what can we do about it? But just remember, this is not financial advice or anything, because in reality I don't know shit about crypto, nor do I know anything about macro economies. But I just want to share what it is that I do. Now, firstly, what I try to do is to understand that if I have a lot of savings sitting in my own bank account, that would mean that my money is going to go down in value constantly as inflation increases. So if inflation, even if it is at 6 or 5 or 7% or whatever they say, but if I believe that it is closer to 15%, that means that in 5 years, half of my savings are going to be gone. The same amount of money will still be there, but in 5 years' time, that same amount of money will be able to buy only half as much stuff. Now, I do believe that having a little bit of cash in the right pocket, in the left pocket, and a little bit in the back pocket is good for emergencies. However, if there is a massive global depression coming, which I believe, I wouldn't want to have too many or too much cash in my pockets. And when I talk about my pockets, obviously I also talk about the banks. So if we want to focus on where I would like to keep my savings, there are 2 places. And obviously, as the name goes of this little channel, Crypto Never Sleeps, well, I do believe it is a good idea to diversify into quality over quantity. And in case you want to know more about that, well then please come and follow this channel, right? We do some live streams. I would recommend you to be there because, and listen to this, my mama, she always told me, don't go out there and fancy yourself. But you know what? There's a difference of bragging or only stating the facts. And I can clearly, with confidence, say that there is no one better than I am when it comes to investing into crypto. All you need to do is follow the streams, and if you don't believe me, please go in and look at my past track record. It's all on the channel. Well, then I think you should keep it in precious metals. Now, I firmly believe that gold, silver, palladium are good options. It is important to understand, though, that you do not want to hold your precious metals in a form of a exchange traded fund. You also don't want to hold it through a cryptocurrency. No, you actually want to hold some physical gold, silver, or whatever precious metals. I think it's a little bit difficult to have a few barrels of oil in the back pocket. Anyway, let's move on. Now finally, besides having cryptocurrencies and precious metals, I did myself choose to move out of the big cities. Now, what I'm gonna say now doesn't really go in my favor because I was wrong. But my initial thought was to go to a place where there's lots of land. And when I say lots of land, I'm talking about the breadbasket of the former Soviet Union. I myself, I live in Ukraine. God knows I did not expect to see the war that we are currently going through. So, you know, even though I was well prepared, diversify, right? Only have a bit of cash in the right pocket, lots of crypto in the left pocket, and some precious metal in the back pocket, and then live in a place where you are, let's say, kind of like offside from the main global economies. Little did I know that not only first the cronies came and then the Russians, and I don't know what's worse. Having said that, I think you get the point. I think it's not a bad thing to go and live in a place where you can actually feed yourself, provide yourself, your family with the food that you need. And that is actually why I chose Ukraine. I may have been wrong, and who knows, is it really going to be so bad? I do not know. But I hope you liked this video, and in case you did, give it a like, share it with your brother or your sister, or if you don't like them, then share it with somebody else. I thank you for passing by. My name is Nico Harachi, and I am number 1.